This is America's Roundtable from Washington, D.C., a weekly radio program with leading voices from America and international thinkers representing the academia, business, media, think tanks, and the political arena. I am Anand Samy, your co-host, joined by Natasha, Srdoc, economist and chairman of the International Leaders Summit, and guest hosts that join us on a regular basis, Becky Norton-Dunlop and Maurice McTigue. We're delighted to have the Honorable Maurice McTigue join us this weekend on America's Roundtable. The Honorable Maurice McTigue joined the Mercatus Center in 1997 as a distinguished visiting scholar, following an illustrious career as New Zealand Member of Parliament, Cabinet Minister, and Ambassador. Prior to his arrival in the United States, Mr. McTigue led an ambitious and extremely successful effort to restructure New Zealand's public sector and to revitalize its stagnant economy in the 1984 through 1994 period of time. As director of the Government Accountability Project at the Mercatus Center, Mr. McTigue is sharing the lessons of his practical experience with policymakers in the United States. He works with officials in the administration, members of Congress, and state governments on applying the principles of government reform, transparency, accountability in the public sector. In 2003, he was appointed to the Office of Personnel Management Senior Review Committee, formed to make recommendations for a new human resources systems, and then the newly created Department of Homeland Security. Mr. McTigue has provided extensive strategic-level advice to the Office of Management and Budget on a wide range of management issues, including the development of a results-based program assessment tool. Most recently, Mr. McTigue has served as advisor to the governments of Louisiana, Commonwealth of Virginia, Puerto Rico, and countries in Eastern Europe on their government reform process. It's great to have you join us this weekend, Mr. McTigue.
Welcome, Mr. McTigue.
Morning, Natasha and Joel. I'm happy to be here.
Mr. McTigue, economists from the Congressional Budget Office have been warning about the economy speeding toward a so-called fiscal cliff created by a combination of government spending cuts and tax increases set to take effect on January 1. This past week, Congressional Budget Office detailed its view that if Washington policymakers don't act before the end of the year, the economy would contract by 0.5% in 2013. The unemployment rate would jump from 7.9% to 9.1% by the end of 2013, according to the CBO, a non-partisan arm of Congress. What would you advise U.S. legislators in regard to avoiding the fiscal cliff?
Well, my first advice would be if you had more courage some months and some years ago to make decisions instead of procrastinating, you wouldn't be facing this emergency situation right now. And this is entirely the product of not making spending reduction decisions when they should have been made and not making tax decisions that were permanent. The idea of making temporary decisions is a catastrophe waiting to happen. Well, the catastrophe has now arrived. The difficulty is going to be that ideologically the two parties are a long way apart, and it's going to be very difficult to find measures that both sides can support. I don't like using the term compromise because compromise immediately makes people bristle and that it says that they have conceded defeat. And what they really need to do is find these are the things that we can agree on. Now, my view is that if they could agree that they would be prepared to do comprehensive tax reform, then I would be happy if they delayed this process by agreeing to leave the status quo in place for the next year while they work through the options for comprehensive tax reform. That would be good. On the spending side, it's illogical for groups to stick to a particular issue that says I won't reduce spending on any of these things, because everything that the government is involved in involves some poor quality spending, and that should always be eliminated. So there are options there, but they haven't been taken in the past. The worst thing that's happened in the last 18 months, in my view, is that part of the new vernacular is about kicking the can down the road, and it's sort of accepted that it's not that important and you can get away with it. The word for that is procrastination, and procrastination is really a result of people not having the courage to make the decision that they should make right now. That's the thing that needs to be addressed, and both sides are equally guilty of procrastination.
Right. I mean, Senate has not passed the budget for 3 years, and I'm not sure whether this is a political maneuvering or does it reveal intentional efforts by deeply unaccountable and non-transparent legislative body?
The first thing that actually reveals is a callous disregard for the requirements of the law, and that's always bad in the process of governance. There is a requirement that Congress actually pass a budget. What I would like to see is the kind of situation that you see in Westminster-style parliamentary democracies where failure to pass the budget means that the legislature is dissolved and a new election has to be held within 40 days. That would certainly focus the minds of the incumbents on actually passing a budget. Mm-hmm. The second thing is that, okay, I suppose technically a continuing resolution is sort of a budget, but it's not what the people deserve. The people deserve a document that clearly sets out the priorities of the administration and of Congress, and they finally come to decisions on what of those priorities will actually be addressed and which of them won't be. And that's the purpose of having a budget, is to allow the public to actually understand what it is that the government thinks is high priority, what kind of resources they're going to put into it, and then a year later being able to measure the progress that's been made. Continuing resolutions fall far short of that, in my view.
Right. I mean, also, when you talked about spending that can be cut right away, we talked to Senator Coburn last week, and he actually publishes a waste book every year. This year, he highlighted more than $18 billion in examples of most egregious ways that taxpayers' dollars were wasted. And let me just share a few of the items that are just incredible. I mean, some tax loopholes for the National Football League and Professional Golfers Association that gets $91 million in tax loopholes. There's a Moroccan pottery classes for $27 million dollar grant from USAID. Efforts to promote caviar consumption and production for some $300,000. I mean, a robotic squirrel named Robo Squirrel of another grant, and one very interesting one that actually a government-funded study on how golfers might benefit from using their imagination, envisioning the hole is bigger than it actually is. I mean, these kind of things.
They don't actually meet my measure of priorities. So, clearly those kind of things should go. And in a time of real fiscal stringency, those things should go. They are emblematic of deeper problems, though. And a lot of the things that you mentioned in that list are things that are really described technically as spending on the revenue side of the budget. They're deductions. That means that you don't have to pay as much tax as you otherwise would. Those revenue spending items are actually equal in size to the total of discretionary spending, and they get very little examination. I think that most of those should go, and that if you want to do something that's going to encourage investment and growth, then take away those deductions and put in place a lower tax rate to compensate for the fact that they've gone. But the taxation system, in my view, is used far too much for social engineering and also for trying to influence people's decision-making. It should actually be tightly focused on a revenue gathering mechanism, and if you want to deliver social policy, then do that by direct payment to the targeted groups of people. It would have to compete with all the other spending then, and you would be able to much better target it at the people you intended to help, rather than having a universal concession that goes to the people you need to help, but also to the people that don't need that help. And it also usually means that you don't get as much help to the people that you want to, and you give a lot of help to people who don't actually need it. That's not good decision making.
As we're talking about limiting deductions, One of the biggest item that actually explores the tax breaks for, it mentions actually for higher earners, but it includes limiting the value of itemized deductions, including municipal bond interest, healthcare insurance, and retirement plan contributions, which would over the next decade raise about $584 billion by itself. When we compare that to raising the basic income tax rates for high earners, as Obama mentioned, that would produce about $442 billion. And I think there is a common ground now between the Democrats and Republicans if they target just limiting the tax break, so practically eliminating the loopholes and deductions.
Well, my preference certainly would be a comprehensive overhaul of the entire tax code, and that would start by scrapping the existing code and starting from scratch again. And if you were to do that, then I think that you would be able to design something that everybody would consider was more fair than the current system. The second thing is, in doing something like that, there should be a clear commitment that you're not going to tax the same income twice.
Right.
So that if taxes have been paid at one level, then they should be recognized as that income flows down to the beneficiaries. For example, if a corporation pays tax when the shareholders get dividends, they should get a tax credit for the tax already paid, and they should pay the difference between that tax paid and the personal rate of income tax. Everybody would see that and say, that's fair. That person isn't paying 15%, that person is actually paying 45%. So they're paying their full share. So transparency in the system would also help. The deductions are really the result of a process that we all hate, and that's called cronyism. The lobbying industry manages to persuade legislators to give them a special deal. That makes me angry because somebody's getting something that I'm not getting. And you have a right to be angry because that means that you have to pay more so that these special interests can pay less. And getting rid of that system, in my view, would be a big step forward. You would do that if you got rid of the exemptions. If everybody paid tax on every dollar earned, and you delivered social policy by direct payment to people, and if you wanted to support particular industries, you did it by subsidies, so that the subsidy had to compete with all other spending, then that transparency would force better decision making.
I was wondering, what would you mention as short-term priorities at this post-election period now? Obviously, both parties emphasize the priority of overhaul of immigration laws. Also, Dodd-Frank Act was one of the items that was mentioned that has to be changed. How would you prioritize these things?
I think the highest priority has to be a return to fiscal responsibility and the introduction into the marketplace of a higher level of confidence and credibility for the governing process. That could become about by a responsible approach to dealing with the fiscal cliff and some evidence that there are going to be solutions going forward in the future that will deal with out-of-control spending, and that there are going to be processes that will produce a better revenue mechanism that's going to have less favoritism in it and is seen to be more honest, open, transparent, and fair. So I think that that's the big issue. When we look at something else, the changing demographics in the United States were clearly a factor in the election, but they've been a factor for a long time before that. During the period of time that I was a member of Cabinet in the Government of New Zealand, I was Minister of Immigration for a period of time. And while we don't have anything like the problems that the United States has with illegal immigration, because it's 1,500 miles of water to the nearest country, so you can't walk across the border. But there are some principles involved in that. And my view is that the first principle is that the government needs to protect its borders so that people are not able to come in illegally. And if they did, you need to return them to the other side of the border from where they came. And you need to do that quickly. The United States has procrastinated or ignored that problem now for 3 to 4 decades. So you now have the result of a major mistake, not securing your borders. You have to deal with that. And in my view, that means that you've got to deal with the problem that there are a lot of people residing in the United States who currently don't have a legal status. You have to find a mechanism that repairs that, and then you have to see that you don't repeat the mistake again. So that means some kind of process that moves those people from illegal status to a legal status. You can put all sorts of criteria in there that they would get temporary residency for a period of time. They prove that they're good citizens that could be adjusted upwards to permanent residency over time, maybe 5 or 10 years, something like that. You recognize children that have been here, born here as American citizens. You do those things, and then you close the borders tight. Then you also put in place something that needs to deal with the labor requirements of different segments of the market, and that is a guest worker program. That works, and that allows people to come in for seasonal work where it's required, but then to return home afterwards. That produces benefits both sides of the border, because those people go back with a level of prosperity that they didn't have before, and that helps on the other side of the border as well. Is that difficult to do? In my view, you only need to look at 2 countries who have major guest worker programs. That's Singapore and Hong Kong. And their guest worker programs work on the basis of the guest workers go home every night to their own country. In Singapore, they go back across the causeway, mainly to Malaysia. In Hong Kong, they go back across the border into mainland China, and it works perfectly well. There is no reason why the United States shouldn't be able to create a viable guest worker program based on those kind of experiences.
Right. I mean, it works also in parts of Europe in the same way. You know, the land borders are easy to cross.
Yes, they are, and the European community has found a way of being able to deal with those problems, and they haven't become weighty and unmanageable.
You are invited to a conference hosted by America's Roundtable and the International Leaders Summit titled America's Responsible Capitalism, Jobs, Healthcare, and Prosperity. Its focus, advancing principled solutions and pro-growth ideas. The summit will take place in Orlando, Florida during the first week of May 2013. For those interested in receiving an invitation, please email leadersummit@aol.com, leadersummit@aol.com, or visit our website for further details, americasrt.com. This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at americasrt. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. Like and share.